Assessing Democracy, point 03. So there's a big debate over among political scientists over what kind of democracy do we actually have here in the United States. And what I want to do is sort of present three different explanations for or descriptions of the kind of democracy we either have or in some cases what we should have. There are some people who argue that what we have in the United States is called a majoritarian democracy. A majoritarian democracy. And what they mean by that, because majoritarian means sort of the majority rules, and so what they mean by that when they say it's a majoritarian democracy is essentially what they're saying is that when you look at the way our government actually functions, basically the government does what the majority wants done. That it really winds up being the case that the majority gets what it wants in our system because of the way it's set up. And so that would be called a majoritarian democracy. There are other people who are very skeptical about that because what they say is that, it's not really the majority getting what they want. What they say is that our system could best be described as democratic elitism. Democratic elitism. And what they mean by that is that when you really look at the way our system is run and the way things actually work, the government is actually controlled by a few elites. There are some people who are very powerful and have a lot, and so they are actually the ones who are in control. And that what we get to do as citizens is essentially choose between elites that are competing with one another. Sometimes this can be Democrats and Republicans, but for the most part, when they're talking about elites, they're saying that there are a lot of issues on which Democrats and Republicans agree on certain issues, and basically those things that they agree on are the things that the elites agree on, like emphasizing private investment versus public investment, the trust and faith in markets as a way to distribute goods. All these kinds of things, according to this argument, are because elites, both on the left and the right, conservatives and liberals, agree on certain things, and that what we get to do as citizens is that we basically get to choose between competing elites. We have different elite groups that compete with one another, and what we do as citizens, we're not really in charge. It's not like they're really concerned about doing what's in our best interest, but in order for them to stay in power, they have to make us happy, or at least not piss us off. And so they have to compete with one another and promise to do certain things and then deliver on those things, or else we vote them out of office. Right? So the idea is that elites are primarily interested in preserving the status quo. And by the status quo, I'm just referring to their own place in society. Elites are primarily interested in making sure that no matter what happens in terms of politics, that they're still in charge. That they're still in charge. So that's the second view, that what we have here is democratic elitism. That it's really not sort of the people being in charge, the majority being in charge. Instead, it's like these elites, these powerful people are competing with one another to be in charge of the government. And basically what we have to choose between are elites that have their own interests in mind, not ours necessarily. Then there's another group that argues that what we have in the United States could best be called pluralism. Pluralism. And the idea behind pluralism is this, that according to pluralists, in the struggle over the allocation of benefits and privileges, what you have are organized groups going ahead and competing for finite resources. That you have different groups who sort of are engaged in the allocation over the struggle over the allocation of benefits and privileges. You have different groups that are trying to get some of the goods, right? So doctors are trying to get something from the government. Lawyers are trying to get something from the government. Labor unions are trying to get something from the government. And all these different groups are clashing with one another, all trying to get more stuff. And that when you look at our political system, it's really a pluralist system where you have these organized groups competing with one another, and that through compromise and through conflict, that's how decisions are made in our political system. That you have competing organized groups. Now, if you look on the lecture notes, one of the things that I wrote down is it says of the three types of democracy listed on page 2, which is the best type as long as you're rating something. I'm sorry, I have to fix this. As long as you're rating something, there are no wrong answers. In other words, the only wrong answer on this thing is to go ahead and leave it blank. So, what kind of democracy do you think is what we either have or should have? Do you think it's truly a majoritarian democracy where the majority rules? Do you think what we have really is a democratic elitism where there are actually elites that are competing with one another, and we really don't have a choice, a real true choice? We are choosing between competing elite groups who are primarily interested in preserving the status quo because the status quo preserves their spot on the top of the heap. Or do we have a pluralist system where what you have are organized groups that are competing with one another for goods, for the benefits and privileges that society provides, and basically that's what's going on? You have these organized groups, and then what happens is these groups, they compete with one another, they clash, they compromise, and then based on all that, they come up with policy, and that's how our political system works. See, those are three different ways of thinking about what really happens in our political system. Now, maybe right now, because you can, if you want to, when I'm done with this next few sentences, you can pause this, and you can sit and try and write out your answer. Which kind of system do you think we have? What kind of system do you think we should have? So I tell you what, go ahead and pause this, and then come back in a second. So pause it right now. Okay, now that you're back, there's no right or wrong answer to this question. There just isn't a right or wrong answer. You know, people see things differently. There's a part of our system that is majoritarian, right? As we'll talk about the House of Representatives, it is a majoritarian institution. Then there are parts of our society that function very much like democratic elitism predicts, right? Where there are these elites that are competing with one another. And there is part of our system that functions very much like a pluralist system would, with groups competing with one another. It's a very complicated political system that we have here with a lot of moving parts. And so if you were sitting there writing going, I really don't know, don't worry about it. And we may come back to this later on and revisit this question and see if your answer has changed. I want to talk about two other concepts in this section. Something called authority, and then something called legitimacy. But you know what? We'll do that in the next one, in Assessing Democracy 0.04.